Eli Morgan had always known that life on the frontier would never be easy, but he had grown used to the constant work and solitude. A seasoned rancher, he had spent most of his life in the rugged hills and fields of Red Mesa, a small town in Wyoming. The land was harsh, but it was home, and Eli was determined to make a living from it no matter the cost. His ranch, a sprawling plot of land dotted with cattle and old wooden barns, was his pride and joy. It was a place where he could be alone, away from the prying eyes of the world, working hard, building his legacy. But despite his strength, his determination, and his tough exterior, Eli was still haunted by a past he couldn't escape. It had been years since the incident, and most people in town had forgotten about it. At least that's what Eli had hoped. But some things can never truly be left behind. The past, no matter how hard you try to bury it, always seems to have a way of creeping back up. And that's exactly what happened one chilly autumn afternoon, when a stranger appeared at the gates of his ranch. The man rode in on a dusty horse, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were worn and his eyes, sharp and cold, peered out from beneath his hat, scanning the land as if he knew it intimately. He was an outsider, and Eli could sense it. Outsiders didn't come around Red Mesa often. The town was too small, too remote, and too hard for most people to survive in. But this man had a presence about him that demanded attention. Eli stood in front of his barn, squinting into the distance, watching the rider approach. When the man drew closer, Eli raised a hand, silently acknowledging his arrival. The stranger stopped just a few feet away, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind howled across the open plains, stirring the dry grass beneath them. Finally, the man tipped his hat back slightly, revealing his weathered face. "Name's Hawkins," the stranger said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm looking for work." Eli studied him carefully. He wasn't sure about this man, but something about Hawkins set off a warning in his gut. It wasn't the way he spoke or even the way he looked. It was the way he carried himself. Hawkins wasn't like the other drifters that occasionally passed through the town. He seemed too purposeful, too knowing. And that made Eli nervous. Eli was used to keeping his distance from strangers. He'd learned long ago that trust was a rare commodity on the frontier. But there was something about Hawkins that Eli couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the way the man's eyes never left him, or the tension in the air between them. Whatever it was, Eli found himself agreeing to offer Hawkins a place to stay for the night. "All right, you can stay the night," Eli said, his voice gruff. "But don't make yourself a nuisance." Hawkins nodded, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I ain't here to cause trouble," he said, dismounting from his horse. As the day turned to night, a storm rolled in over the hills, sending a chill through the air. Inside the small cabin, Eli and Hawkins sat in silence, the only sound being the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, there was an uneasy stillness, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The silence was finally broken when Hawkins spoke. His voice was soft, but there was an underlying tension in it, as though he were about to say something important. "You know, Eli, the past has a funny way of catching up with you," he said, his eyes locking onto the rancher's. "I reckon you've got a lot of debts that you're still paying off." Eli's heart skipped a beat. Hawkins' words seemed to hang in the air like a weight. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly feeling as if the walls were closing in on him. He knew exactly what Hawkins was referring to, something he had buried deep in his past, something that up until now no one had ever mentioned. Years ago, when Eli was young and foolish, he had made a deal with a notorious outlaw gang. It was a desperate move, born out of a need to protect his ranch and his family, but it was a deal with the devil. The gang had offered Eli the help he needed, protection from rival ranchers, money, and resources. But in return, Eli had made a promise that would haunt him for years. He didn't want to think about it, but Hawkins's words stirred up memories he'd spent years trying to forget. "Debt? What are you talking about?" Eli said, his voice a little sharper than he intended. "That's long gone." Hawkins leaned forward, his face cold and serious. "You can run from it all you want, Eli, but the truth is there's no escaping it. Not this time." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I know about your debt, and I'm here to collect." Eli's pulse quickened. He had hoped this day would never come. But now it had. Hawkins wasn't here for a friendly chat or to pass the time. He had come to settle the score. I don't know what you're talking about, Eli said, trying to keep his composure. But deep down, he knew Hawkins was right. He could feel the weight of his past crashing down on him, and there was no way out. Hawkins didn't smile. His gaze was unwavering. You remember the deal you made, don't you? The one where you promised to pay back what you owed, no matter the cost? Eli's mind raced. His throat went dry. He had tried to forget the details of that deal, but now, with Hawkins sitting across from him, it all came rushing back. The terms of the deal had been simple. Eli would give the gang access to his ranch and its resources. In return, they would protect him from anyone who dared challenge him. But the price was steep. Eli had agreed to do whatever they asked whenever they asked it. He had never fully understood the weight of that promise until now. Hawkins continued, his voice like ice. The time has come to fulfill that promise. You need to go to the barn. There's a board there, old but important, and I need you to do something. Something that'll cost you everything. Eli stared at him in disbelief. What do you want me to do? Hawkins didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, you need to strip away everything that matters. Only then will you be free. And if you don't, well, we'll take it all. Your land, your cattle, your legacy. The rancher felt a chill run down his spine. Hawkins wasn't just talking about money or goods. He was talking about something deeper, something that struck at the heart of Eli's identity. And for the first time in a long while, Eli felt truly vulnerable. He was trapped in a corner with no clear way out. I'll give you one chance to make it right, Hawkins said, his eyes hard as stone. The board must fall, and you must make it happen. Eli stood up, his hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about a debt anymore. It was about everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build. He had to face his past no matter how dark it was. The stakes were higher than ever. And if Hawkins wasn't lying, then Eli was about to lose everything. The rancher knew what he had to do. But as he stepped out into the cold night, a part of him wondered if it would be too late. Would the board fall as Hawkins promised? Or was there something even darker waiting in the shadows? The night felt colder than usual as Eli made his way toward the barn. The wind whipped around him, sending dry leaves scattering across the ground, but he hardly noticed. His mind was racing. Hawkins's words echoed in his head. The board must fall. What did it mean? And why was it so important? He could hear the creaking of the barn doors in the wind, and as he reached the entrance, a wave of unease washed over him. The barn was an old structure, weathered by years of storms and harsh winters, but it held sentimental value. It was more than just a building for Eli. It was a place where his family's legacy had been built. It was where his father had taught him how to care for cattle, how to manage the land, and how to be a man. To see it torn apart would be like losing a piece of himself. Eli stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of hay and old timber. In the dim light, he could just make out the familiar sight of the barn's interior. Stalls, tools, and the large wooden beams that had withstood countless storms. But in the corner, where the barn's foundation met the ground, was the board. It was an old, thick piece of wood that had been there for as long as Eli could remember. His father had always said it was a symbol of the ranch, a piece of history that should never be touched. It was sturdy, solid, and unyielding. Eli stood in front of it, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this the moment when everything would change? Could he really destroy the board as Hawkins demanded? The thought made his stomach turn. But Hawkins had made it clear that there was no choice. If Eli didn't do it, everything he had built, the ranch, his life, his family's name, would be lost. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and touched the surface of the board. It felt cold, just like the rest of the barn. For a moment he hesitated. How had things come to this? He thought about all the sacrifices he had made, all the hard work. Was this how it was all going to end? As his fingers ran across the grain of the wood, a memory surfaced. He remembered his father, strong and determined, standing in front of this very board, telling him that it would one day be his responsibility to protect it. This ranch is your heritage, Eli, his father had said. This board is a symbol of our strength. Never forget that. Eli closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The past wasn't something he could escape, no matter how hard he tried. The deal with the outlaw gang, his father's legacy, it all came rushing back. He had made a mistake years ago, a decision that had seemed right at the time but now felt like a weight around his neck. And now, Hawkins was demanding payment for that mistake. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts. Eli turned quickly, his hand still resting on the board. Hawkins stood in the doorway, watching him with a cold gaze. The stranger's presence was like a shadow in the dim light, his eyes gleaming with an almost predatory interest. "I see you found it," Hawkins said, his voice low and calm. "That's the board, the one your father left you, the one that's been passed down through generations. But now it's time to let it go." Eli clenched his fists, his anger rising. "I'm not letting you destroy everything I've worked for," he said through gritted teeth. "This ranch is my life. You don't understand." Hawkins took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Eli's. "Oh, I understand more than you think. This land, this ranch, it's just a part of the deal, Eli. You're not just protecting the land anymore. You're protecting a promise, a debt that was made long before you even knew what was at stake." Eli's breath caught in his throat. The weight of those words hit him harder than he expected. Hawkins wasn't just here to take what he wanted. He was here to settle something far older, something rooted in Eli's past. "I didn't know what I was getting into," Eli admitted, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. "I didn't understand what it would cost. But I can't go back now." Hawkins nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "No, you can't. But you can choose how this ends." He paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. "The board must fall, Eli. That's the only way to pay the debt."
"Only then will you be free of it." Eli stood still, staring at the board.
His heart pounded in his chest as he considered Hawkins' words. Was this really the only way? Could he destroy this symbol of his family's history, his legacy, to save himself from the past? It felt wrong. It felt like giving up everything for nothing. But the alternative, losing his ranch, his future, was even worse. The silence in the barn grew heavier, pressing down on Eli's chest. Finally, he stepped forward, determined to make a decision. He reached for the board again, this time with more resolve. His hand closed around it, and with a deep breath, he began to pull it free from its position. The board creaked as it shifted, and for a moment Eli thought he could hear his father's voice in his mind, telling him to stop. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. With one final push, the board gave way and it fell to the ground with a loud crack. Eli stood there, staring at it in disbelief. The barn was suddenly too quiet, the weight of the moment sinking in. The board that had once been a symbol of strength and legacy was now broken, just like his past. Hawkins watched the scene unfold without saying a word. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. Eli's heart was racing, but there was no sense of triumph, only a strange emptiness, as though he had just lost something that could never be replaced. "What now?" Eli asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hawkins stepped forward, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Now we take what's owed," he said. "The past is settled, and your future is yours to rebuild." But even as Hawkins spoke, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had done what was asked of him. He had destroyed the board. But was it really over? Was this the end of his debt, or was there more to come? The stranger turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "You're free, Eli, for now. But remember, nothing stays buried forever, not even your past." Eli stood in the barn, the weight of those words lingering in the air. He had done what Hawkins had asked, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss of something far more important than a piece of wood. And as the storm raged outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had freed himself from one part of his past, but at what cost? And more importantly, what would come next? The rancher didn't know, but one thing was certain. He was about to face a future that was even darker than the storm outside.